and welcome. My name is Remco, and today I'm talking to Jerry McGrath. Jerry is a strategist, an organizer, and sometimes agitator with a wide range of experience ranging from Japanese automobile manufacturing through the Banff Center for the Arts, Artscape Launchpad, and since recently a more alternative independent platform called UKAI, through which he has provided opportunities for a range of artists and creatives. Jerry, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So looking at your experience and the things that you've done over a range of years, it seems that there's a clear thread in your work of how do we organize, how do we gather, which is a question that is, of course, particularly pertinent at the moment. So what are some of the lessons so far that you have learned about ways to organize?
I mean, I think it's interesting that you see a thread through the work, and I imagine like over time there has been a thread that's emerged, but most of it started by accident. When I finished university, I couldn't find work. I think I applied to about 120 different jobs. I ended up getting 2 interviews, one with a security company where I would walk around the warehouse district in Toronto looking out for trouble, and the other teaching English in Japan. And so I opted to go to Japan for a year. Ended up just loving the experience of having my own ignorance revealed to me on a daily basis, and made a home there for quite a few years. And as a part of that, I got to do some work in the automotive industry, as you mentioned, and really came to acknowledge and recognize that there are lots of different ways of organizing to get things done. I worked with Mitsubishi during a period when they were looking to be acquired by Daimler Chrysler. That ended up not happening, that transaction. But I got to work with their sort of senior leadership team, or their up-and-coming leadership team within the organization, and learned a lot about how they organize to get work done. And so I think if there's a pattern to it, I think it's generally just that we tend to fall into habits or routines without critically reflecting on what we're doing. We're exposed to models, we're socialized to relate to other people in a particular way, and then we don't really spend a lot of time interrogating those routines over time because they're comfortable, they provide an easy way of filtering new information, and even if they're no longer adaptive to the world that we're in, it's sometimes very difficult to transition into other ways of being with other people. And so I don't really have a preference in terms of how we organize to get things done, but I think we do have a responsibility to call into question some of the assumptions that we hold about how we are organized by the systems that we're in. And I think that's particularly true right now because some of we'll say some of the shifts in terms of how algorithms are playing a more critical role in how our world is organized will make it a lot harder to sort of extract out some of the assumptions that go into designing these systems. And so if we're not critical now, it's going to be much more difficult to be critical down the road.
And what you're talking about a little bit as well is sort of the limits that when you are trying to reorganize embedded ways of organizing, right? You've been in a lot of the places that you've been in are fairly large and hierarchically structured. Did you feel that tension or that friction in trying to devise new ways of coming together within those circumstances?
Yeah, so I'll talk first about the Banff Center. I spent 8 years working at the Banff Center. I got there shortly before the Great Recession. In 2008 is when I started working there. And so my mandate shifted very quickly. I came in as a program manager, but then all of the programs that we had grown used to running, well, they disappeared. And so my responsibility was to generate new business. And one of the commissions was, well, we have these different communities. We have Indigenous leaders, Indigenous artists. We have 4,000 artists coming through a year. We have energy sector companies who are investing money, so oil companies. We have the local community, we have environmentalists. And so how do we create a space that doesn't privilege particular ways of knowing, that allows these communities to come into conversation with each other? The assumption was that by leveraging the diverse communities that call the Banff Centre home, we might be able to do different things, particularly around reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada, but also around social innovation generally. And yeah, of course, there's resistance, because I think there are certain patterns that develop over time, certain assumptions about how you're supposed to treat people or how you're supposed to show up, that can create moments of challenge. So I'll give one example. In our programs, we tend to, so we like to center an Indigenous elder. I worked a lot with Elder Dalahul, who was an elder, a Blackfoot elder that we worked with at the Banff Centre. And we did a program with the University of Alberta that involved former Prime Minister of Canada, Kim Campbell. And both the elder, and in this case, it was actually, sorry, I'll have to go back here. And that's okay, we can always edit these things. But we were working with Elder Corley Powderface from the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and with former Prime Minister of Canada, the Right Honourable Kim Campbell, both of whom had expectations about how they would be treated in a public event. And there were opportunities for conflict and disagreement, and the institution's reflex was always to support the politically connected, the folks with access to money and wealth. But the moral position of the organization was that we needed to prioritize Indigenous participation and voices in programming. And that always led to tensions, because there wasn't an easy way to reconcile the different needs that folks had. With Artscape Launchpad, I was involved in helping to set up the new space and the programming, a 30,000 square foot facility here in Toronto. And of course, Artscape exists in partnership with real estate development. And Toronto is increasingly becoming unaffordable, particularly for creators and for artists. You have an arts organization that's in partnership with real estate development, and this creates a lot of opportunities for confusion, for conflict. When you're taking money from a group that's forcing artists out of community in order to create spaces for artists in community, there's necessarily a tension there. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but I think the challenge is that drawing attention to these like recursive patterns of meaning making can get you in a lot of trouble. And so how do you ensure that you have the protection and security that you need, because there are a lot of spoken and unspoken rules about what's okay to discuss or not in contexts like that.
Yeah, it reminds me of the situation in Montreal a little bit, where there's a lot of money and effort flowing into sort of the core of the city in order to create a vibrant cultural artistic scene, whether it's through installation works or commissioned works or festivals. But the flip side of that is that a lot of more independent art making and artists are getting pushed further and further out, because there is no point of entry if you are not already part of the system that is creating those opportunities.
Yeah, and I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think you've exactly hit on it here. And there's no incentive for those who currently have access to resources to make space. Like, even if they morally want others to take part in this, there's a finite number of resources there. There's a scarcity mindset. And so to allow others in actually can feel quite threatening. And so although we see in the sector folks saying the right things about wanting to support decades of like oppressive systems and exclusion, there really aren't a lot of incentives to make room, because the assumption is that by making that space, I will lose opportunities. And I did some work with dance in Canada around the Decolonizing Canadian Dance Project. And it's the same situation, where we have all of these forms of dance that have been excluded, mainly because we have assumptions about what professional dance looks like. There's a stage, there's an audience, there's tickets. And as soon as you start allowing in Bharatanatyam or other forms of culturally specific non-Western dance, you're putting an even greater strain on presenting spaces, on resources, on training, on mentorship. And dance is already struggling without an influx of new forms. And so yes, there's this pull of like morally we need to be more inclusive and representative of the populations that we see in our cities and in our country. But then what happens to the opportunities that I used to have access to? And I think that that's a hard conversation that we're not quite willing to have yet, mainly because it can be very scary, especially if it happens in public.
Yeah, and then you start thinking about, let's say, the politics of togetherness, right? Who decides? It's not just how to gather, but also where to gather and who is doing the gathering. That still exists within hierarchical structures rather than more a self-organizing or a networked way of coming together.
Yeah, and who holds spaces where as you say, who holds the spaces where people come together, who decides? Like one of the critiques of Banff was that even though there was a commitment to having a more diverse cohort of artists present at the institution, that they were often cherry picking prominent examples of individuals and not really supporting grassroots or emerging artists who are drawing on different cultural traditions. And that's a challenge, right? Particularly when you don't have an institutional capacity to reach communities because you've historically targeted a different group of folks, and now suddenly you're being asked to reach out to communities that you don't have a traditional relationship with. That's a lot of work, and sometimes organizations don't have the commitment to actually exploring what those pathways actually look like.
Yeah, but even on that level, and maybe we're going too deep into the weeds here, but exactly as you say, we're being asked. That in itself is already, again, your own system within a larger system that is a relationship of dependency, where you make choices based on basically the people who butter your bread, and whether that is done through which motivation are you then making those changes or trying to make those changes, and can they actually take hold if you're doing it for those reasons?
Well, and I think being asked to doesn't necessarily have to be an external ask. Like I think, like in my practice at least, like the motivation to focus my attention on places that I haven't traditionally focused is internally generated, and so I'm being asked by the moment, like I'm being asked by a world that's suddenly coming to terms with these systems of oppression in ways that are new, even though the systems have been there for a very long time. I think your point is an important one, though, that we don't always know what is motivating the shifts that organizations and individuals are undertaking, and we may not even know. Like I may think it's coming from something that's internally derived, but really, the funding system is sending out clear signals, and I need to accommodate that as well if I want to persist. And so it's never like there's no simple explanation for the choices that we make. But I guarantee that if we have that sort of nuanced conversation, that the current discourse doesn't really support that kind of uncertainty or hesitation around motivation. So it would, yeah, I think your point is a fair one, and I would say I think one of the challenges we face is this sort of binary, like we're either doing it for the right reasons or the wrong reasons, or we're either doing the right thing or we're doing the wrong thing. But of course, it's a tangle amongst various factors. But picking them apart is a lot of work. Isn't actually supported by the ways that we communicate with each other in the world right now. So. Yeah, I mean, that's not really an answer, I guess. It's just a point that I think it's incredibly complicated, and I don't think we live in a world that has much tolerance for complicated things right now.
Were some of these considerations motivating factors in founding or starting UKAI as a way to be at least partially outside the system that you found yourself in and experiment with new forms?
Yeah, I think so. UKAI, UKAI, just to provide a bit of background, so the word UKAI refers to a kind of fishing that's popular in Japan, but also not popular, but comes from Japan and Southeast Asia and China and other areas, where cormorants, which are big black birds, have a ring put around their neck, a metal ring tied to a string. And then there's like 8 or 10 of these cormorants swimming alongside a boat. In the boat, it's at night. They have pine burning, a thing called a kagaribi, I think it's called. The fire draws fish up, these sweet fish. They're called ayu. The cormorants catch them, but then they can't swallow them because of the ring around their neck. But they keep fishing, which I think is interesting. And then their neck fills up with fish. The usho, like the people who are fishing, they pull the bird in, they dump the fish into a bucket, and then they serve the fish to the community, but also to tourists. It's often used for tourism. Charlie Chaplin thought it was like the ultimate essence of like Japanese aesthetics and art, but others are a little more ambivalent because it does seem quite hard on the birds. But I was taken to see this when I lived in Japan as a relocation trainer, and I must admit, like my first instinct was to try to sort it, like to make sense of it. And so I saw it and I looked and I'm watching and I turned to my friend and I said, well, it's a bit cruel, isn't it? And she gave me this look I didn't quite understand. And to me, it was always a regret that rather than actually being present for this encounter, this event, this experience, I had to sort it, like good, bad. I had to find a bucket for it. And it denied me the possibility of actually diving deeper into it. And so the organization is an opportunity to continue to ask some of these questions and maybe hold back a bit from making a decision about whether a particular way of doing things is right or wrong. I've always understood UKAI, the organization, as an art project. We work fairly steadily with 20-25 artists. I'm very proud that since the start of COVID arriving in North America, we've given out close to $85,000 in sort of grants and commissions and other supports to various artists. And we try to work with folks that feel a little bit like UKAI the fishing, where you see it and you're like, well, this doesn't quite fit what I believe to be true. I don't know where to sort it. I don't know where this goes. But rather than just sorting it anyway, it's like, all right, let's hold off on making sense of this for as long as we can, and explore what possibilities exist in the form. And so, like concretely, we're doing work around financial precarity in the gig economy, because a lot of artists that we work with, they work part-time at Uber, they're working under the table cash jobs, like they're making a go of it in different ways. And we're working with a credit union to explore the day-to-day precarity of being in the gig economy. We do a lot of prototyping work, so we're supporting like culturally specific non-Western performance to go digital. They get asked to go digital, like everyone's got to go digital, everyone's got to go digital. But of course, all of the tools and platforms are set up for Western European or corporate sort of use. So if you're a taiko group, like you're not going to take your taiko onto Spotify, because no one's going to go to Spotify and say, geez, I really want to listen to taiko. So how do we find ways of honoring the core of the form? And so like with the taiko, we ended up building a haptic feedback suit so that people could actually feel in their chest a performance, and they could actually make their own performance using just the keyboard and feel it. And we've done some augmented reality work. We've done some calligraphy work, working in a kind of Sufi dance tradition. But yeah, so anyway, these are the types of projects that we get interested in.
I'm particularly interested in when you say you make sort of a shift to rather the artistic field to the gig economy broadly. For the creatives that you work with, even though they are artists, designers as well. So you see a connection between their way of working and their situation in a more broad economic situation then.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're interested in the work that they do, but we're also just interested in them in being alive and continuing to do the kinds of things that they want to do. Like I think UKAI as fishing is really interesting because it's sustainable, right? It doesn't actually degrade the ability of these freshwater systems to regenerate. provides some income, it provides attention, it honors a connection to nature. And so I don't think we can sort of isolate out like the creative practice, the money, like it's all tangled up together. And so we want to understand the full expression of being whatever. And I think a lot of these folks, is interesting, like you say, artists or creators, I think they only self-describe in that way when it's useful. Like I don't know that many of them go home and say I'm an artist, but I think when they're applying for funding, sure, they're an artist. And if they're applying for a commission and they're a creator or whatever is useful for that context. And so yeah, the categories are very fungible as well.
That's interesting because it has been over a good number of years, there's been sort of a glorification of the hustle from mostly the startup community, and that this is a noble and honorable thing to do, and more people being in sort of a gig worker situation might not experience it necessarily as heroic when they are practically in that situation.
Yeah, no, and I think we have to be careful about who benefits from that story, right? That each of us is accountable to ourselves, and that each of us are in constant competition. Like I think you know this, but I use musical chairs like as a metaphor for the world that we're in, and it feels like, and if you're not familiar, assuming most people are, but musical chairs, you know, there's one winner, multiple losers. There's scarcity as a part of the game mechanic. It honors, like it rewards aggression. It rewards, you know, violence. It rewards speed. It punishes compassion. It punishes people who are differently abled. And it seems like we've sort of internalized this model of musical chairs in all aspects of life, that each of us is responsible for finding our own space to sit. And if you don't make it, then that's your own failure. And you have to stand to the side until the game is over. And I just don't know. Like some people like that game. I was never a fan of it. It feels like we should have other games that we're allowed to play. Like I got nothing against the hustle. I got nothing against sort of the startup world. It's when those moral positions become hegemonic in everywhere else. If they start to define everything, our access to water, our access to knowledge, you know, that's a problem for me. And so for me, it's like I don't care how people fish for the most part. But I would like to know that there are options in terms of how we get our fish. And in the same way, like how people decide to earn their money, that's cool. But again, I think there needs to be choices there. Fortunately, we seem to be in a culture that doesn't really, it prioritizes the ideas of sort of the assumptions of scale, of growth, of efficiency. And if you want to prioritize anything else in your work, well, too bad. The systems aren't really set up to support you in that. You either get big or get efficient, or you fall behind. And if you want to build an artistic practice around compassion or around generosity, it's an uphill slog. And so that's part of the work, is how can we actually model systems that center different values in their implementation.
Yeah. I want to come back to the topic of compassion and care that you mentioned, but a very brief side track there. You mentioned the musical chairs, the fishing. In your writing for UKAI and just as a private consultant, you use imagery of tree root systems or of mycelial networks most recently. What do you see as the role of metaphor in reaching people with these ideas?
Metaphor is a useful way to get people to understand situations differently. So I'll give like a bit of an example and then talk specifically about the work I do now. Metaphor are a way of organizing the universe so that we can make sense of it. And as a part of my undergrad, I was interested in how fairy tales came to influence how people saw the natural environment. So I looked at the evolution of the story of Little Red Riding Hood over the years. And in its original inception, it was probably orally transmitted, but its first written version Little Red Riding Hood is told to not go off the path. She goes off the path. She gets eaten by the wolf. End of story. Like there's no redemption. There's no man with an axe. And so the meaning is fairly clear. Like the forest is scary. Listen to your mother. Over time, the story evolved to a point where, Little Red Riding Hood is sexually assaulted in versions of the story, particularly at the end of the 19th century. And the reason for that is because of sort of industrialization. Factories were moving into somewhat rural areas, and men from the city were more frequently traveling. And so the warning became nature is a place where bad men hide. And so you need to be cautious. The introduction of the man with the axe, like, is this idea of the nuclear family, and a woman needs a man to protect them from the dangers of the world. And then the new versions of Little Red Riding Hood are very much about, her own emancipation, her own self-authorization, and the lesson being that we must sort of inhabit our own power, and nature is a foil, or is like a character in that story. And so I think for me, metaphor is a way to invite people to reconsider the evidence of the world around them. It allows them to sort of filter through. And so, like, I do a lot of work around the idea of decay. I'm really interested in Artengine and, like, the mushroom at the end of the world. This idea that we have a culture that loves growth. We have a culture that loves disruption and transformation, but it doesn't seem all that interested in the process by which living things die and then are transformed into new ingredients for new beginnings. And so Anna Tsing, she writes in Mushroom at the End of the World about how in the Pacific Northwest, for example, they'll clear cut a stand of pine, and then they'll abandon it because there's no profit to be had there. But 8 to 10 years later, matsutake mushrooms will start to sprout, and they're extremely valuable in Japan, but in the Far East as well. And so pickers will sneak into these abandoned sites and pick matsutake mushrooms, and then sell them to intermediaries, usually Vietnamese, who will then sell them into the Japanese market. And this is all done illegally, because it's trespassing, but everyone knows it's happening. Like, it's a very formalized structure. And so I think if we start thinking about decay of culture, or decay of systems, and inhabiting those systems that are no longer occupied by capitalism, what possibilities start to emerge? And I think that the metaphor is an entryway into that sort of mental game, right? Because if we only understand growth or scale or efficiency, then we look at the world and we process information through that lens. But if we start looking for decay, we start seeing it in more places, and it starts suggesting different ways of conceptualizing of things. And so that's for me the importance of metaphor. Is it's a way of organizing sensory experience in new ways, and maybe suggesting different pathways or opportunities.
Yeah, that reminds me of some of your writing where you had, I believe, as the title, "Stop Watering Dead Plants," which points to that idea of decay. You've also brought up previously ideas of corals and lichen. Can you talk a bit more about ideas of death and decay, and how they play out in your practice?
So when COVID, when quarantine started in March, at UKAI, we had to decide how we might respond. And one of the conversations we had was around what happens when people die and we're not allowed to gather to mourn the dead. And so in service to safety, in service to the sanctity of health, we were going to allow certain rituals to collectively die. And so the question became, all right, with the energy and intention that used to go into gathering to mourn our dead, or other sort of rituals that don't contribute necessarily to public safety, how might we inhabit those spaces in order to reveal some of the things that we're losing? So we worked with a burlesque dancer, for example, and burlesque obviously isn't something that's viable under COVID, And she had originally planned as a part of an art project to deliver a set of sort of domestic vignettes of her burlesque character trapped in domesticity. And she thought that this would be a fun exploration of what was happening to her and the losses she was experiencing. But over the course of the residency, she came to acknowledge that she needed to mourn and to grieve. Like, she couldn't always just transform this character into something else. She had to let it die. And so we tried to create a space and an opportunity for her to artistically, like through her practice, to mourn this loss and this dying. And what does it mean to gather to mourn the loss of something like intimacy or an imaginary character working in the form of burlesque? I also think on the economic side, we're seeing. So we're working with a credit union, and they started, interestingly enough, as a service for Dutch immigrants to Toronto. It's the Duca Credit Union. And when Dutch immigrants came to Canada, they didn't have a financial history, so they were not eligible to receive mortgages, loans, other financial products. So Duca was founded as a way to provide financial solutions to people that weren't eligible because the system didn't recognize the good work that they'd done. Over time, they've become more and more like a traditional bank or credit union. I mean, they're still a B Corp. They still return to their members. They're a cooperative. But their core business remains committed to growth and profit. In the pursuit of growth and profit, they are creating labor conditions where fewer and fewer people can rely on steady income. There's more and more precariously employed people. In Toronto, they figure it's about 15 to 20% are relying on the gig economy as their core income. And so what that means is that fewer and fewer people, by their own standards, become eligible for mortgages or for financial support because their income isn't something that's recognized by the bank in the operation of their work. And so what we're seeing is an organization that's basically creating the death of its own model. And normally what a bank or credit union would do is they would just give money to causes so that people wouldn't be angry at them for the harm they were creating. But the opportunity is to say, well, like what potential does this situation carry for us to occupy things differently? And so what they're contemplating is a return to that early history where they want to create a peer-to-peer lending platform. So if folks are experiencing volatility or precarity, you can then provide a short-term loan to support others in your community, but then use that evidence as a criteria for eligibility for a mortgage or to own a home or whatever it is you want to do. And so to me, these are ways that our approach can actually address not just the symptoms of the situations that are being created, but actually trying to generate models that make use of the existing energy in the system to imagine a different way of doing things.
That's super interesting, and also the way that is then currently being co-created by the people it is meant to serve, by the sound of what you're saying. So again, sort of more a distributed model of creating in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, it is participatory, and I think that that's important. But I worry that when we have participatory systems, we're just putting the onus on the consumers to change their behavior to fix things. You know, it's like the old. They were gonna actually force all the bottling companies like Coke and Pepsi and all that to set up a very aggressive sort of recycling or reuse campaign. I think it was in the 60s maybe. But then they convinced the US government to allow them to handle the problem, and they put all their money into marketing the fact that it was us as individuals who have the responsibility to clean up the mess that their core business model is creating, right? And so I think that there's an important sort of dance there where I don't want the artists that we work with to feel like it's their job to fix the systems that are fucked up. Like yes, there has to be a relationship on the institutional side, but ultimately, like it is the profits that are driving the decisions that create these conditions. And so, how do we intervene at the point in which the death or dying is being created, rather than sort of turning it over to the individuals that are suffering in those systems.
And what could the role of the artist and the creative be at that point?
Yeah, and how do we do that in convivial structures, right? Like I think one of the challenges is that we tend to create useful things for useless people, and we don't have any incentive to actually help people be more useful. And I don't mean useful in the sense of creating value. I mean more active participants in the stories, like more sovereignty over the decisions that are being made around them. But we don't actually support technologies, and I don't mean just like technologies, but like ways of organizing or ways of communicating that facilitate that. And so one of the fears I have is that we seem to be turning over things that make us human, like compassion, generosity that we've talked about. We've turned them over to institutions and systems. With COVID, in the name of health, we turn over decision making to medical expertise, and at least on the left, in the circles I'm in, and then we ridicule those who might disagree with prioritizing medical expertise in that way. Or if we see someone on the street who's street involved or homeless, we say, well, it's not my problem, right? Like there's an institution that takes care of that. Or if I see someone not wearing a mask, I immediately look for law enforcement. I look for someone in a position of power or authority with the capacity to leverage violence to intervene on my behalf. And so we don't actually own our own responsibility to turn toward each other, and the gift of that, right? Like the ability to show love to someone I don't know. I don't want to lose that. I want to own that. But we seem to be in systems that really want us to turn over that agency to either non-human automated systems or to institutions that can feel inhuman. And so part of the work is also like how do we show people ways that they can own their own potential for grace, if you want to call it that, like their own ability to turn towards other people, and then the tools to do that effectively. And so it isn't necessarily about owning one's own success, but I think it is about owning one's moral obligations to other people.
So maybe a good way to go back to those themes of care and compassion, and you already mentioned the Mushroom at the End of the World book, where there's also some talk of moving certainly away from hierarchy, but then through networks with nodes into a more into entanglement, let's say, with knots and entanglement, and from the idea of from the sort of startup, let's just say broadly, startup idea or Silicon Valley tech idea of fixing things. We've identified a problem and we're going to fix that through technology, to caring for things and to nurturing for things. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that idea of care in the way we come together.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm sharing a lot of stories here, but when I was growing up, my father used to always tell a story about how our family was in Northern Ontario, but we started a fire and burned a town to the ground, and so we had to move south to Toronto, to Aurora. And I always thought it was apocryphal, or I didn't think it was like a real thing. And then more recently, my father, perhaps due to isolation, has dug more deeply into the family history, and it turns out that our family was involved in the Matheson fire of 1916, which burned 500,000 acres and killed hundreds, likely more, people. in Northern Ontario. And the fire started when a number of people that were trying to establish homesteads there burned in July. They were burning the woods. And these small fires all joined together and created one massive fire that then followed, I guess, along the railway corridor and ended up destroying multiple towns and hundreds of lives. And there was no transportation, so many people just walked south, like they just left. And you talk about entanglement. They didn't feel any sense of obligation to the territory they burned. Like they just moved. They just grabbed their stuff and went south. And to me, that's sort of like suggestive of the mindset that creates these conditions, right? Where we don't see ourselves as being entangled with other people. We don't see ourselves as being entangled with landscapes. We don't even see ourselves as being entangled with our own bodies. Then of course we operate from a set of assumptions that tends to alienate us from what's going on around us. And so a return to sort of compassion and generosity isn't about explicitly centering this value. It's like a reminder that actually we do have responsibilities to each other and to the land we're on and to the stories we tell. And we can center that in the work, even though it's not particularly profitable. Because right now there's burning a lot of forest down and then walking away is a business model. Like it's not even I always joke that the Silicon Valley model is like you have a river and you're fishing it, you walk 2 kilometers upstream and start fishing there and then call it an innovation, right? Like all you're doing is bypassing the way things have been. And so, yeah, I think the opportunity is to create spaces that acknowledge that sense of connection, which I think we do feel, and then prioritize and reward values that aren't currently elevated. I think the COVID moment is asking us to understand the experiences of frontline workers. We're being asked to empathize with a part of the labor force that had been mostly invisible. It's asking us to interrogate some of the assumptions in the broader systems that we're a part of, and whether or not what we're willing to give up in order to feel differently. I'm not super optimistic, but I think if enough people organize around a set of values and they show that it can work, then at least it's a viable alternative, right? Like at least we can say, oh, there is another choice. I don't have to play that game. I can play this other game that feels a little more aligned with the world I want to be in. But to do that requires a rethink in terms of connection and entanglement. And John Burroughs is a legal scholar from Victoria. Well, he's not from Victoria, he's Anishinaabe, but he basically argues that denying our entanglements is the source of evil. As soon as we pretend that we're not connected to other people, to histories, to what came before, to what's coming ahead, that's when we become capable of really morally outrageous behavior. And so, yeah, I think mycelial networks, metaphors that point to the way that the natural world is inexorably entangled, is a useful reminder to people that they may feel isolated, but they're not, that we're actually connected to each other and to the world in really profound ways. And that we have systems that are asking us to forget that, to forget the body, to forget the natural world around us, to forget our culture. And so, yeah, that's ideally where the work will point to.
Yeah, and some of the things that you just mentioned, so you already mentioned conviviality, technologies. It reminds me of the Ivan Illich's book, Tools for Conviviality, in which he talks about if I paraphrase correctly, his idea of conviviality is personal realization through interdependence, and which it was written in the early 70s, and his idea of tools echoes what you're saying as well, that a technology is not necessarily an app or a platform or something, but spaces can be a technology, organizations can be a technology, and in this book, a tool. How can technology and tools play a role in some of these systems of care and these, let's say, networks of effective togetherness?
Yeah, and I think, I think there's a really interesting resurgence and interest around Illich and some of that work. I'm a huge fan, obviously, but I wonder, one of the concerns I have, and I guess that we respond to in the work, is that there are so many things that are asking us to be objects. Like if a particular system is going to work efficiently, then understanding us as conscious subjects is a problem. And so it's like, well, how do we make people as bot-like or machine-like as possible in order to ensure the efficiency of these broader systems? And conviviality, like you say, it isn't particularly efficient. It actually invites multiple subjects to be in conversation with each other, and that can be time consuming, and that can be clumsy, and that can be messy and difficult. And what we're seeing, like I think on both the right and the left, is this move back to authoritarianism, like this idea that the best way to generate community and solidarity is through conforming to a set of ideals that have been pre-selected for use, and so we become objects of ideology. And I think social media contributes to this, and sort of the platforms available to us to talk about these things, because they, as I mentioned, like they don't support nuance in a particularly useful way, and they're incentivized to keep us either satisfied or angry. And so all we ever get is information that confirms the views that we hold, or information that's guaranteed to motivate us to respond, and to comply to sort of whatever reflexive trigger we've been presented with. And so I feel like it's hard to have a conversation around autonomy and agency during a lockdown. But my guess is that we're going to have a lot more conversations about this once things start to become figured out. Because right now it doesn't feel like any of the sort of dominant discourses are particularly tolerant of multiple subjects acting from a place of their own agency, and that scares me a little bit. That the logic of sort of algorithmic culture is also being translated into political and social culture as well. Yeah, and so I think it's interesting that you bring up Illich, because I definitely think that he was responding at the time to what he saw as the encroachment of education into all aspects of life, and now we're seeing something very similar around health. And there's historically, like the eugenics movement came out of a sort of an elevation of medical expertise that was drawing on some deeply, deeply flawed and racist assumptions. And so although I acknowledge the current need to prioritize particular kinds of expertise, we should also be aware that there's a risk to that, and we do need, in the arts and everywhere, folks that are willing to complicate or make entangled some of these patterns and assumptions.
Do you feel that there's space for that there's room for that, for artists and creatives to still do that? Maybe
not in Canada. I do think the Canadian art system is, I think the high levels of funding that the arts system receives in Canada is both a boon and can also be a challenge. It's a career for folks sometimes, which means that the choices about what positions to take publicly are balanced by a variety of sort of concerns and criteria. I think absolutely we're going to see different voices, different responses emerge. I'm not confident that the Canadian art system is is currently available or open to that. But I think because everything is so interconnected that eventually we will be asked to hold a position or take a position in that conversation.
Necessities of the moment play, of course, into that as well. I don't know if you've seen the recent announcement from the Canada Council for the Arts about new monies being allocated towards job creation within the arts. And I remember that you have talked about this a while ago, that you saw that as something that was coming up, that the idea of job creation and job security was going to play an important role in the next couple of years at least.
And then we're going to see institutions that have effectively shut their doors and laid off massive numbers of staff, then accessing this funding to be able to come back. And that to me is, it doesn't really incentivize innovation or experimentation or pushing the limits of the field, right? When what you're being assessed on is how many steady jobs can you produce. I mean, I think it's good for the institutions. I don't know if it's good for the art. And so I do worry. I mean, as you say, I mean, this isn't a surprising thing. It may be a few years before there's a willingness to reopen that conversation. But my worry is that folks that have something to say through their art that aren't currently able to access public support, they'll find other means. They'll find other ways of getting done what they need to get done. And that will likely involve corporate partnership, and that's a different kind of bargain altogether. And I'm not saying it's a worse one. It's just a very different one. And so we'll have corporate art that reflects a particular point of view on the world, and then we'll have funded art which reflects a particular set of government priorities, either directly or indirectly. And I'm not sure that the two worlds will necessarily come into conversation all that often, because they'll have different priorities and different goals in mind. And that doesn't, I don't know, that worries me a little bit as well.
Yeah, so the work then is maybe to find a third way.
And a fourth way, and a fifth way, and a sixth way, and a seventh way. Yeah, I mean, to make things messy, right? Like I'm in the process of writing a book, because that's what you do when you're in quarantine and you're privileged. But it's effectively an argument for more localized moments of disorder. And not necessarily disorder in the sense of disobedience or like public property destruction, but more just developing habits of identifying what a particular moment or system is asking us to do, and then deciding whether or not we want that thing. And we need more of that. Like, we just need more questions about, well, hey, well, why are we putting a price tag on water? Or why are we allowing certain patterns like the lack of clean drinking water in Indigenous communities to persist for decades, while others are addressed with much more promptness? I guess the force that's acting against that is that it feels less tolerant of multiple positions. Like we're demanding more and more conformity to a set of beliefs that may be helpful. Like, I'm sure they come from a place of caring, but in the absence of intelligent discourse, or resistance or disagreement, they don't really actually get refined or improved over time. We sort of hold on to them, and everyone around us confirms the same story, and then we're never asked to grow. Like Richard Sennett, 1970, wrote a book called The Uses of Disorder. And he argued that in a lot of white middle-class communities, when we're in our teen years, we adopt these identities in order to process information, to not be overwhelmed by the feelings and experiences of being an adolescent. But eventually, the complexity of the world proves that those sort of identities are inadequate. So we have to discard them or evolve them. But his argument is that in more privileged communities, folks like me are never asked, like we never have to experience a reality that actually challenges the identity I've assumed. And so I grow well into adulthood acting like I did when I was 17 or 18 years old. And with social media, the opportunity to be sort of insulated from other ideas is even greater. And art's role has traditionally been to expose people to uncomfortable or previously invisible sort of ways of seeing the world. Like, was the idea of feeding our own culture back to us. But if it forfeits its responsibility to do that work, then I don't know who will, right? Like who will challenge entrenched belief, if not for the artists. And so I think part of it is also about making spaces for artists that want to complicate the conversations that we are having, either because they just want to mess with stuff, or just because their work naturally does. And so that's part of this as well. And to earn a living doing it, like I think we need to reward that. I think we need that kind of complication. Like they shouldn't be ostracized or punished for stepping outside the bounds. Like I think that's the work. Yeah.
That sort of leads into the last question, or the sort of close this off, was the idea of possibility. What are some of the possibilities, or one great possibility that you see in this moment for artists and creatives?
And when you talk about this moment, like, do you mean specifically the sort of the conflux of conditions that we're operating in?
Exactly. Yeah, sort of the whole complicated sphere of influences that we find ourselves in.
There's two or three things. I think one, there's a lot of debate and demands for change in how the art system works, and that's really encouraging. I think too often the demands are that sort of the power just invert, that we sort of turn over the systems we have to new ownership. And I think that can be helpful and useful. But I also think that there's an opportunity to reimagine what art systems look like. Like art will be fine. Art institutions will fail and struggle and collapse. And right now, the Canada Council's investment seems to prioritize the institutions over the art, but that may not always be the case. So I think that there's an opportunity to reimagine. There's an opportunity to reimagine what art's work looks and feels like. I also think there's a lot of spaces for that to happen in. Like our system, our economic system, it empties out a lot of spaces. And to me, those are opportunities that we can move into, and not just like physical spaces, but digital spaces as well. I always loved the story about how there was a drought in California that led to a bylaw that people couldn't fill their swimming pools. So they had all these empty swimming pools, but then the skaters, like the skateboarders, moved in and occupied these swimming pools and developed a whole subculture of sort of around skateboarding in these spaces and sites. And I feel like there's hope. We just need some creativity, and we need a willingness to not break rules, but force people to be clear about what the limits are. Because the default right now is exclusion. There are mansions where everyone inside is dead, but the windows are locked and the doors are closed, so we don't use it. And so I think reoccupying those spaces, both symbolic and literal, is a possibility, is a source of optimism and possibility. I think the technologies that too often are leveraged in support of sort of hegemonic discourses can also be repurposed and reoccupied in interesting ways. And so I remain optimistic that people prefer a more complicated existence to a simpler one. Like the simple life is tempting, but there's always that doubt, right? And so I feel like there's a possibility for a shift there. And then another big one is that I think we can start imagining work outside of Canada. I think that the geography, like the mapping of art practice has often been east-west, sometimes north-south into the US or across the ocean to the UK. But a lot of the more interesting partnerships that I've been involved with are, they're in Tijuana or in Hong Kong or in Ghana. Like there's just a lot of really creative people getting access to tools right now. And I think, at least in the Canadian art system, if we can enter into those relationships humbly, then really, really cool things will happen. Yeah, and so I think that's a site of possibility. And then I think I'm starting to feel like there's less. We've spent the last 20 years, it feels like, arguing for art's value, like all of these different rationalizations or justifications for why investment in the arts is desirable. I'm starting to get a sense that argument doesn't need to be made quite as often anymore. It depends, right, where you're getting your money from. But I do believe that there's a general sense of awareness that having a more diverse and richer culture helps all of us, and not having to necessarily get into the details of how that shows up in an economic model. And so I feel like that might free up space for people to pursue projects that normally would have been excluded from consideration, because they sort of contribute to our collective inheritance, and are therefore of value. And I do think COVID is in some ways reminding us of our interconnectedness and the fact that we need to draw on some shared common resources. I'm also really interested in the idea of poaching. So if this is, I think this will be, I feel, possible. I think the less human our economic system becomes, the easier it will be to morally justify poaching as a practice. And for like 200 years in England, poaching was the most popular practice in terms of both frequency and public approval. And so I do feel like we're going to move back to poaching. And I think artists can lead the way in terms of what poaching looks like. It's a kind of occupation, but temporary. And so I'm excited about that as well.
Well, poaching artists is a wonderful way to close off this terrific conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time and for sharing your insights and your experiences with us. And we look forward to what UKAI is going to do in the near future. So people can check you out online, I'm sure.
Yes, we are somewhere on the internet. Yeah.
UKAI.ca to begin with, and you'll take it from there.
Exactly.
Jerry, thank you very much.